A kind cafe manager was fired for helping a black-stranded driver. And the next day, 50 vehicles showed up at her door. The light above the door of the daily grind flickered, a frantic, dying pulse against the oppressive white of the blizzard. Each stutter of the neon open sign seemed to mirror the frantic, dying beat of Elena's own hope. Outside, the world had been erased by a furious curtain of snow. Inside, the world was just as empty. It was 9 p.m., an hour past closing, but Elena remained, wiping down a counter that had already been wiped a dozen times. The heat was turned down to a skeletal hum, a compromise between the cost of the gas bill, already 2 months overdue, and the frigid ghost of winter seeping through the window panes. This cafe was not hers, but it was all she had left. It was the last frayed thread connecting her to a life that included a paycheck, a purpose, a reason to leave the small, cold house that had grown cavernous since her husband, David, had passed. Elena's hands, chapped and red, paused their circular motion. She stared at her reflection in the polished chrome of the espresso machine. A woman of 34 who looked 44, with shadows under her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights spent staring at a stack of bills on the kitchen table. There was the final notice for the mortgage, the stark red warning on the electricity bill, the polite but firm letter from the town council about property taxes. She was drowning, and the silence of the empty cafe was the water filling her lungs. Her boss, Mr. Henderson, had been clear. "If you can't make the numbers work, Elena, I can't make you work. This is a business, not a charity." He'd said it over the phone that afternoon, his voice devoid of the warmth he reserved for the town's wealthier patrons. The implication was clear. The cafe was failing, and he was already looking for someone to blame. Staying open an hour late, burning electricity for 0 customers, was an act of quiet defiance she couldn't afford. Yet she couldn't bring herself to surrender to the cold and the dark just yet. She felt if she turned off that flickering light, a part of her would go out with it for good. Her gaze drifted to the small, worn photograph tucked into the corner of the cash register. It was of David, his smile wide and effortless, taken on a summer day that felt like it belonged to another lifetime. He had been a volunteer firefighter, a man who ran toward trouble, whose kindness was as natural and constant as his own heartbeat. "One good deed, Lena," he used to say, his voice a low rumble against her ear. "It's like a stone in a pond. You never know how far the ripples will go." Now, the pond felt frozen over. That's when the bell above the door chimed, a startling, metallic sound in the profound quiet. The blast of Arctic air that followed felt like a physical blow. A man stood there, stamping snow from heavy boots, his large frame seeming to fill the entire doorway. He was a black man, broad-shouldered and tall, dressed in thick layers that couldn't quite hide the shiver racking his body. His face was etched with weariness and cold, his breath pluming in the cafe's chilled air. In Harmony Creek, a town that prided itself on its politeness but practiced a quiet, deep-seated prejudice, a stranger like this, at this hour, was an anomaly that would set curtains twitching and phones ringing. Elena felt a familiar, reflexive flicker of caution, a survival instinct honed by years of being an outsider herself in this homogeneous town. But then she saw his eyes. They were tired, yes, but clear and direct, holding no malice, only a desperate plea for refuge from the storm. In them she saw not a threat, but a human being at the end of his rope. The thought of David, who would have already been striding forward with a warm greeting, shamed her hesitation. The man's voice was a deep, gravelly bass, roughened by the cold. "Ma'am, I am so sorry to bother you this late." The sign, it was still on. "My truck broke down about a half-mile back. The tow services, they're not running." "Not in this," he gestured vaguely toward the white abyss outside. I just need somewhere to get warm for a little while. Until the storm lets up." This was it. The moment of decision. Her boss's voice echoed in her head. "This is a business, not a charity." Turning him away was the logical, self-preservational thing to do. It was what Mr. Henderson would demand. It was what the town would expect. But as she looked at the man, shivering, his gaze holding hers with a stark, simple honesty, she saw the moral calculus for what it was. a test. And she knew, with a certainty that defied all logic, that she could not fail it. She thought of David's ripples in the pond. "Of course," she said, her own voice sounding warmer than she felt. "Come in, please. Let me get you something hot." She gestured to the small table nearest the humming baseboard heater, the warmest spot in the whole place. She was already breaking the rules. And as the man moved gratefully toward the table, a profound and terrifying sense of peace settled over her. She had made her choice. The man sat down heavily, pulling off his gloves to rub his frozen hands together. They were large, capable hands, but the skin was stretched tight over the knuckles from the cold. Elena moved behind the counter, her actions now fluid and purposeful. The coffee in the commercial urn was hours old and bitter, sludge she was meant to have thrown out. Instead, she turned on the espresso machine, the whir and hiss a welcome intrusion into the silence. It was expensive to run for one cup, but it was the right thing to do. She pulled a shot of rich, dark espresso and steamed a pitcher of milk, the sweet, warm scent filling the air. She poured it into a large ceramic mug, the kind reserved for regulars, and placed it on the table in front of him. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. He wrapped his hands around the mug, a look of pure, unadulterated relief washing over his face as the heat seeped into his skin. "Truly, thank you." "It's no trouble," Elena lied. It was all kinds of trouble. Her phone buzzed in her apron pocket. The screen lit up with Mr. Henderson. Her heart leaped into her throat. She silenced the call, her thumb trembling slightly. She couldn't answer. She couldn't lie to him, and she wouldn't tell him the truth. The man, who introduced himself only as Marcus, seemed to sense her unease. He looked from her worried face to the darkened street outside. "I'm putting you in a difficult position, aren't I?" Elena managed a weak smile. "The world is in a difficult position tonight. The least we can do is offer a little warmth." She saw the pot of chicken noodle soup she'd made for lunch, still simmering on the warmer. Most of it was left. It was destined for the bin. Without a second thought, she ladled a generous portion into a bowl, grabbing a basket of day-old bread meant for the food bank tomorrow. It was her food to donate, her small contribution. Tonight, the need was right in front of her. She set the soup and bread on the table. "You must be hungry." Marcus looked at the steaming bowl, then back at her, his eyes shining with an emotion that went beyond simple gratitude. It was a look of profound understanding, as if he could see the entirety of her struggle in that single selfless act. He saw the worn collar of her shirt, the fatigue in her posture, the silent worry that clung to her like the cold. He didn't say anything for a long moment. He just bowed his head slightly, a gesture of immense respect. He ate slowly, savoring each spoonful as if it were the finest meal he'd ever had. The silence between them was no longer empty, but filled with a quiet, shared humanity. As he ate, Elena's phone buzzed again. Henderson again. She ignored it again. The third time, she finally sent a quick text. "Just locking up now. Everything is fine." It was a lie, a stark and deliberate one, and it sat like a stone in her stomach. She was choosing the stranger over her job, over her own precarious survival. It felt both insane and absolutely necessary. When Marcus was finished, he pushed the bowl away, a look of renewed life in his eyes. He reached into his pocket, pulling out a worn leather wallet. "Please, let me pay you for this. For all of it." Elena shook her head immediately. "No, absolutely not. It was leftover. It's a gift. A gift I can't accept without offering something in return," he insisted gently. He pulled out a $100 bill and placed it on the table. For Elena, that bill was more than a week's groceries. It was a tank of gas. It was a fraction of the electric bill. It was a lifeline, but accepting it felt wrong. It would turn her act of kindness into a transaction, cheapening the very impulse that had driven her. "Please," she said, her voice soft but firm. "Don't. It was my pleasure. Just be safe when you leave." He studied her for a long, searching moment. He saw the photograph of David by the register. "Your husband?" he asked, his tone gentle. Elena nodded, a lump forming in her throat. He's been gone 3 years. He looks like a good man, Marcus said, his gaze respectful. He had kind eyes. The simple observation, the acknowledgement of the man she missed so terribly, undid her. Tears pricked at her eyes, and she quickly looked away, busying herself at the counter. Marcus didn't press. He simply sat in the quiet, allowing her the dignity of her grief. After a few minutes, he stood up. My brothers should have my location by now. They're resourceful. I need to try and meet them, but I won't leave you empty-handed. Before she could protest again, he slid something small and metallic across the table. This is collateral, he said. I will be back for it. Promise. Until then, it's yours. A guarantee that my debt will be paid. Elena looked down. It wasn't money. It was a ring, heavy and ornate, crafted from what looked like solid silver. It was designed in the shape of a serpent coiled into a circle, eating its own tail. Its eyes were tiny, glittering chips of jet. It was unusual and clearly valuable. I can't take this, she whispered. You're not taking it, Marcus corrected her softly. You're holding it. For me. I will be back for it. His tone held a finality that allowed for no argument. He pulled on his gloves, gave her one last, long look of sincere gratitude, and then with a final "God bless you, ma'am," he stepped back out into the raging storm, disappearing into the white chaos as quickly as he had appeared. Elena stood alone in the silent cafe, the heavy silver ring cold in her palm, the $100 bill still lying untouched on the table. She had a terrible feeling that the cost of her kindness would be far greater than a bowl of soup. The next morning, the world was a pristine, frozen sculpture. The blizzard had passed, leaving behind a deep, silencing blanket of snow. The sun, when it rose, made the landscape glitter with a cold, cruel beauty. Elena walked the half-mile to the cafe, her boots crunching in the unnatural quiet. The dread that had been a low hum the night before was now a roaring in her ears. She saw Mr. Henderson's polished sedan parked out front, and her stomach plummeted. He never came in this early. She pushed open the door to find him standing behind the counter, his arms crossed, his face a mask of pinched fury. Beside him, peering out the window with a self-satisfied smirk, was Mrs. Gable from the bakery next door, the town's most notorious gossip. Elena, Mr. Henderson said, his voice dangerously low. Care to explain yourself? Mr. Henderson, Save it, he snapped, cutting her off. Mrs. Gable was kind enough to inform me that you had a visitor. Long after closing, a very large, very unfamiliar man. He spat the word unfamiliar, as if it were a curse. It was the closest he would come to saying what he really meant. She was concerned for the safety of the business. So she called me, and I called you, didn't I, Elena? 3 times. You lied to me. You told me you were locking up. His truck broke down, Elena said, her voice trembling but steady. He was freezing. The storm. I don't care if he was the ghost of Christmas past. Henderson's voice rose, his face turning a blotchy red. My rules are clear. You close at 8. You don't let strangers in after hours. You don't turn my cafe into a homeless shelter. You endangered this property. You showed a shocking lack of judgment. What if he had robbed you? What if he had wrecked the place? He was a good man, Elena insisted, her own anger starting to rise. He just needed help. And you're fired? Henderson declared, the words hanging in the air like icicles. Effective immediately. Pack up your personal belongings and leave the key on the counter. Mrs. Gable looked away, feigning a sudden interest in a snowdrift outside, a faint, pleased smile on her lips. Elena felt the floor drop out from under her. Fired. The word was a death sentence. This job, this meager, soul-crushing job, was the only thing standing between her and utter ruin. Mr. Henderson, please, she begged, the fight draining out of her. You don't understand. I need this job. Should have thought of that before you decided to play Good Samaritan with my property, he sneered. Clear out your things. I want you out of here in 5 minutes. He turned his back on her, a gesture of final, dismissive contempt. Numbly, Elena walked behind the counter. She gathered the few items that were hers: the worn photo of David, a spare sweater, a well-read paperback. Her hands shook so badly she could barely fit them into the small cardboard box she found. She didn't take the $100 bill Marcus had left. Felt like blood money. She left it on the counter, a silent testament to the choice she had made. As she placed the key next to it, her eyes met Henderson's one last time. There was no sympathy there, only cold, hard business. She walked out of the daily grind for the last time, clutching her box, the chiming of the bell behind her sounding like a funeral dirge. The walk home was a blur of shame and terror. The eviction notice on her kitchen table was no longer a threat. It was a prophecy, and its fulfillment was now just a matter of days away. She had traded her entire life for a bowl of soup and a moment of warmth for a stranger. Back in the suffocating silence of her house, Elena sank onto the sofa, the cardboard box on her lap. The cold was more profound here than it had been in the cafe. She couldn't afford to run the furnace properly, so the air was thin and sharp. Despair, a feeling she had kept at bay for so long, finally washed over her in a great, crushing wave. She had failed. David had always been the strong one, the optimist. She was just the one he'd left behind, slowly sinking. She let the tears come then, silent, hot tracks on her cold cheeks. She had nothing left. No job, no money, no hope. Her fingers, numb and clumsy, fumbled in her pocket and closed around the silver serpent ring. She pulled it out, letting it rest in her palm. It was heavier than it looked, solid and real. It was the only tangible thing she had from last night's disastrous decision. As she stared at its intricate design, a memory surfaced, hazy at first, then sharp and clear. A box in the attic. David's box. It held his service medals, old photographs, and a handful of newspaper clippings he'd saved. He hadn't been one to brag, but his mother had insisted on keeping a record of his heroism. A strange, inexplicable impulse propelled her from the couch. She climbed the rickety stairs to the attic, the air growing colder with each step. She found the box tucked under the eaves, covered in a fine layer of dust. She lifted the lid, the scent of old paper and cedar filling her nostrils. She sifted through the contents. A medal for bravery, a photo of his graduating class at the fire academy, and then a small stack of yellowed newspaper clippings held together by a rusty paperclip. She slid the top one off. It was from the Harmony Creek Chronicle, dated 8 years ago. The headline read, "Local volunteer firefighter saves man from burning wreckage." Her breath caught in her throat. The article described a fiery crash on the interstate just outside of town. A motorcycle had skidded on a patch of oil, crashing into a guardrail and bursting into flames. David had been one of the first on the scene. While others waited for the full fire crew, he had plunged into the smoke and flames, pulling the unconscious rider to safety just moments before the fuel tank exploded. Elena read the words, her heart aching with a familiar mix of pride and loss. Then her eyes fell on the last paragraph. The writer, whose name has not been released pending family notification, is reported to be a member of the Iron Serpents Motorcycle Club, a group known for their cross-country rides and fierce loyalty. Elena's gaze shot down to the ring in her hand. The serpent, coiled and eternal. The Iron Serpents. Couldn't be. It was too impossible, too much of a coincidence. She frantically scanned the other articles. One, a follow-up piece, mentioned the writer's name. A young man named Michael Rhodes. He had survived, thanks to David's selfless act. The name didn't mean anything to her, but the club was everything. Marcus, his brothers who were resourceful, it wasn't a coincidence. None of it. The breakdown, his appearance at her cafe, the one place he could have found her. It was a ripple David had started 8 years ago, finally reaching her shore. A flicker of hope, so faint she was afraid to breathe on it, ignited in the cold darkness of her heart. That fragile hope was nearly extinguished the following afternoon. A sharp, Authoritative knock echoed through the house. Elena's heart hammered against her ribs. She opened the door to a man in a crisp suit, his face impassive and stern. He held a clipboard and a thick envelope. "Elena Rossi?" he asked, his tone devoid of any warmth. "Yes. I'm Mr. Sterling, from the county bank. I'm here to serve you with this." He handed her the envelope. "It's the final notice of foreclosure and eviction. As you know, you are 3 months in arrears on your mortgage payments. The bank has exercised its right to reclaim the property. You have 24 hours to vacate the premises." Each word was a nail in her coffin. 24 hours. Where would she go? What would she do? She had no family nearby, no friends with room to spare. She was utterly, completely alone. "Please," she whispered, the word tasting like ash. "Isn't there anything I can do? An extension?" Mr. Sterling looked at her with an expression of mild impatience, as if her desperation were a bureaucratic inconvenience. "The time for extensions has passed, Mrs. Rossi. The process is in its final stage. A bank representative will be here tomorrow at noon to change the locks. I suggest you have your belongings removed by then." He gave a curt nod and walked back to his sensible sedan. Leaving Elena standing in the doorway, the eviction notice clutched in her hand. This was it, the absolute bottom. She stumbled back inside and sank to the floor, the cold linoleum seeping through her jeans. Her gaze fell on the silver ring, which she'd placed on the mantelpiece. It was her only asset. A pawn shop might give her a few $100s for it. Enough for a bus ticket somewhere, a few nights in a cheap motel. It was the logical choice, the only choice, but she couldn't do it. The ring wasn't hers to sell. It was a promise. It was collateral for a debt of kindness, and Marcus had said he would be back for it. In the face of total ruin, clinging to this single point of honor felt like the only thing she had left. To break that trust would be to break the last essential piece of herself, the part that David had loved, the part that still believed in the good of the world, even as it crumbled around her. So she did nothing. She sat in her cold, dying house, the eviction notice a death certificate for her life, and she waited for the end, holding fast to a single irrational promise. Morning came, gray and unforgiving. Elena had spent the night packing a few sentimental belongings into 2 suitcases. The rest of her life, the furniture, the dishes, the memories embedded in the very walls, would be left behind for the bank to dispose of. She sat on her packed suitcase in the living room, watching the clock on the wall tick toward noon. Each tick was a hammer blow against her heart. 10 minutes to noon. 5. Then she heard it. It started as a low, distant rumble, a vibration she felt in the floorboards before she could place the sound. It grew steadily, a deep-throated growl that seemed to be coming from everywhere at once. It wasn't a truck or a plane. It was something else, something powerful and multiplied. She rose and went to the window, her heart pounding with a strange new rhythm, a mix of fear and a wild, impossible hope. What she saw stole her breath. Turning onto her quiet, snow-lined street was a procession. It wasn't one vehicle or 2. It was a river of chrome and black leather. Motorcycles, dozens of them. They moved with a disciplined slowness, their engines a synchronized, thundering chorus. They filled the street from end to end, 50 of them at least, their headlights cutting through the gray morning. They pulled to a stop, lining both sides of the road in a perfect, intimidating formation, and cut their engines in unison. The sudden silence was more profound than the noise had been. Neighbors' curtains twitched. Doors cracked open and were quickly shut. This was an invasion. At the head of the procession, a man dismounted from the lead bike. It was Marcus. He looked different today. The weariness was gone, replaced by a calm authority. He wore a leather vest emblazoned with the same coiled serpent as the ring. Beside him, another man dismounted, older, with a graying beard and eyes that held the weight of command. He was clearly the leader. They walked up her snow-covered path, their boots making no sound. They stopped on her porch. Marcus's eyes found hers through the window, and he gave her a small, reassuring nod. Elena opened the door, her hand trembling on the knob. The older man stepped forward. Mrs. Elena Rossi? He asked, his voice a gravelly baritone, yet surprisingly gentle. She nodded, unable to speak. My name is Rhodes. I am the president of the Iron Serpents Motorcycle Club. This is my second, Marcus, whom I believe you've met. He goes by Preacher on the Road, Rhodes added with a small smile. Because he has a habit of finding grace in the most unlikely of places, his eyes, sharp and intelligent, took in her packed suitcases, the despair on her face. It seems we've arrived just in time. I don't understand, Elena stammered. Rhodes's expression softened. 8 years ago, a man pulled my son, Michael, from a burning motorcycle. That man was your husband, David Rossi. He saved my boy's life. In our world, Mrs. Rossi, a life debt is sacred. It extends to the family for all time. We've been looking for you for years, but you moved after David's passing and we lost the trail. Then, 2 nights ago, by some miracle, Preacher's truck breaks down in a blizzard, and the one door he knocks on for help is yours. He shook his head in wonder. He called me the moment he left your cafe. He told me about your kindness. He described the photo of your husband. He knew. We all knew. The universe was finally showing us the way to repay our debt. Just then, Mr. Sterling's sedan pulled up behind the long line of motorcycles. He got out, looking annoyed and bewildered by the spectacle, and marched toward the house, clipboard in hand. Excuse me, he said officiously, pushing past Rhodes. I have bank business here. Mrs. Rossi, it's noon. I'm here to secure the property. Before Elena could even react, another biker stepped forward. He was younger, clean-shaven, and wore a sharp suit underneath his leather vest. He held a briefcase. That won't be necessary, the man said, his voice crisp and professional. My name is David Chun. I'm legal counsel for the Iron Serpents organization. You must be Mr. Sterling. He opened his briefcase and produced a file. As of 9:15 this morning, the full and outstanding balance on Mrs. Rossi's mortgage, including all fees and penalties, has been paid in full via cashier's check. This is the confirmation from your bank's headquarters. Her property is no longer in foreclosure. You are, in fact, trespassing. Mr. Sterling stared, dumbfounded, at the papers Chun thrust into his hand. He stammered, his face turning from pale to red to a sickly white. He looked at Elena, then at the 50 silent, imposing men who stood like sentinels on her street, and then back at the legal document. Without another word, he turned on his heel, practically ran back to his car and sped away. The reward, when it came, was not a quiet trickle but a thundering, overwhelming flood. The Iron Serpents did not just save her house. They resurrected her life. Rhodes placed a hand on Elena's shoulder. David saved my family, Elena. Now you're our family. And we take care of our own. What followed was a blur of motion, a symphony of methodical kindness. The biker lawyer, Chun, spent an hour on the phone, his voice sharp and authoritative, clearing her other debts, negotiating with the utility companies, setting up a trust fund in her name with a sum that made Elena's head spin. Another man, a burly giant with a tattoo of a wrench on his forearm named Grizz, was a master contractor. He walked through her house making a list. Roof needs patching. Furnace is a death trap. Plumbing's shot. We can fix this. And they did. The Serpents, who the town of Harmony Creek saw as a terrifying horde of outlaws, transformed into the most efficient work crew imaginable. They swarmed her property with a quiet, disciplined energy. Shingles were carried up ladders, the rhythmic pop of a nail gun echoing through the neighborhood. A brand new furnace was unloaded from a truck that had appeared as if from nowhere. Plumbers and electricians from their ranks descended into her basement. They worked with a purpose that was humbling to watch. They weren't just fixing a house. They were repaying a sacred honor, and they were doing it with love. Mr. Henderson drove by in the late afternoon, his jaw dropping at the sight of 50 motorcycles and a full-scale construction project at his fired employee's home. He slowed, his face a comical mask of confusion and fear. Preacher and Rhodes saw him. They exchanged a look, then calmly walked to the end of the driveway. They flagged him down. He rolled his window down a crack, terrified. "Mr. Henderson," Rhodes said, his voice calm and even. "We understand you own the Daily Grind." Henderson nodded mutely. "And you fired this good woman for an act of kindness." Henderson swallowed hard. "We won't be causing you any trouble," Rhodes continued, a cold smile touching his lips. "In fact, we'd like to be your customers." He then led a procession of 20 of his men into the cafe. They didn't say a word to Henderson. They simply bought everything he had in stock. Every pastry, every bag of coffee beans, every last drop of milk. They paid in crisp $100 bills, leaving him with a full cash register and completely empty shelves. As they left, Rhodes paused at the door. "We appreciate the service," he said. "But from now on, my brothers and our very extensive network of friends will be patronizing the Sunrise Diner across the street. We hear their owner treats her staff with respect. They had ruined him not with threats, but with commerce." He was left standing in his empty cafe, holding a fistful of cash that felt like ashes. The transformation of the town's perception was as swift as it was absolute. The fear that had gripped the neighborhood gave way to stunned awe. Mrs. Gable watched from her window as Elena, laughing, handed a cup of coffee to a massive, tattooed biker who was carefully repainting her porch railing. The image was so incongruous with her prejudiced worldview that it seemed to short-circuit her brain. These were not thugs. They were craftsmen, protectors, gentlemen. Elena was not a victim. She was a queen, surrounded by her court. That evening, her house was filled with warmth and light for the first time in years. The new furnace hummed a steady, powerful tune. Every light worked. The scent of roasting chicken filled the air. A feast Elena had insisted on cooking for them, her own offering to this new, unbelievable family. They ate together, bikers in leather vests sitting at her dining table, on her sofa, on her floor, their deep laughter filling the spaces that had so long been haunted by silence and grief. They told her stories of the road, of the brotherhood, of the son and brother David had saved. They didn't see her as a charity case. They saw her as the widow of their hero, a woman of profound integrity in her own right, the keeper of a sacred debt. She wasn't a project to them. She was family. 6 months later, the open sign at the corner of Main and Elm Street glowed with a steady, welcoming light. It no longer read, "The Daily Grind." The new, beautifully carved wooden sign read, "David's Place." After Mr. Henderson's business had predictably collapsed, the Iron Serpent's lawyer had helped Elena purchase the cafe for a pittance. They had helped her renovate it, turning it from a drab, failing coffee shop into the warm, beating heart of the community. It was always full now, a mix of locals who had come to adore Elena and the steady stream of bikers who made it a point to stop in on their journeys, always leaving a generous tip and a story about how David Rossi's legacy lived on. Elena was no longer the tired, desperate woman with shadows under her eyes. She was a business owner, a friend, a matriarch to the most unlikely family Harmony Creek had ever seen. She moved with a confidence and joy that seemed to radiate from her, warming everyone she met. One crisp autumn afternoon, Rhodes and Preacher sat with her at one of the tables, sipping coffee. The late sun streamed through the clean windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. The photo of David still sat by the cash register, but now it was in a fine silver frame, a gift from the club. "He would be so proud of you, Elena," Rhodes said quietly, his eyes full of paternal affection. Elena looked around at her bustling cafe, at the happy faces of her customers, at the 2 men who had become her staunchest protectors and dearest friends. She thought of that terrible, snowy night, of the choice she had made between fear and kindness. She had chosen kindness, and in doing so, had discovered that the ripples from one good deed, from one ember of warmth offered in the cold, could indeed return as a tidal wave of grace, powerful enough to wash away all the sorrows of the world and build a new life from the wreckage. A single act of compassion, she now knew, was never a final cost. It was always, in the end, the first and most crucial investment.